ਪੇਸ਼ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਲੈ ਰਿਹਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਰਮੀਲਾ ਥਾਪਰ ਜੀ ਸਕਰੀਨ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਆ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਸਾਂਝੇ ਕਰੋ ਅਸੀਂ ਅਖੀਰ ਤੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਵਾਲ ਜਵਾਬ ਸੈਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਿਲਾਂਗੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਰਮੀਲਾ ਥਾਪਰ ਜੀ
थैंक यू प्रोफेसर लखवीर सिंह बहुत बहुत थैंक यू ਤੁਸੀਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਬੁਲਾਇਆ ਇੱਥੇ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਬੜੀ ਸ਼ੁਕਰਗੁਜ਼ਾਰ ਹਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਬੁਲਾਇਆ ਮੈਂ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਚ ਦੇਵਾਂਗੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਮੇਰੀ ਹੁਣ ਆਦਤ ਪੈ ਗਈ ਹੈ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਸਾਲ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਨੇ 35-40 ਸਾਲ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਨੇ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਚ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਦੇਣ ਦੀ ਸੋ ਕੁਛ automatic तरह चल रहा है. This talk is based, as Professor Lakhbir Singh said, this talk is based on my recent book, Voices of Dissent. And this is a book in which I discuss some forms of dissent from the Indian past, some of which link up with the present. In this talk, I shall begin by trying to, first of all, define what I mean by dissent. I shall then discuss two broad examples of some dissenting ideas from two past traditions. And in the latter part of my talk, I'll try and refer to a couple of examples that suggest a linkage, a connection between the way in which dissent was expressed in past times and some of the ways in which it has been expressed in our time. My interest in the subject of dissent is not a recent interest, nor was it roused primarily by increasing attempts to disallow dissenting opinion in some parts of the world today, including our own society. Nevertheless, it is a notion that I think is important to understanding the history of any country and certainly the history of civilizations. I have been writing on the concept of dissent in pre-modern India off and on for almost half a century. And I see dissent as central to social and cultural change, a centrality that is not new to history, but we tend more or less to ignore it when we are writing our history. Even the evolving of what we call civilization is a process in which both dissent and consent were exercised in the selection of that which is acceptable and that which is to be rejected. And remember that civilization is an ongoing process of people accepting and rejecting traditions from the past and building on those and creating new traditions. The selection was made by contemporary evaluation as also by later historians. And we tend to pay little attention to these selections as debates, assuming that the process was always a consensual process. So the element of debate gets underplayed, but the element of debate is very, very important. My other purpose is to suggest the continuity of the presence of dissent in various forms throughout the centuries. Some characteristic forms can be recognized as having continued to be effective in present times as well. My example of this will come from the Indian national movement for independence and our subsequent efforts to establish a democratic society. Let me begin then by attempting to define what I mean by dissent. It stems from a difference of opinion or a disagreement, but it is not arbitrary. It may begin with a minor disagreement, but is recognized as dissent when it refers to a specific issue of some substance. and an issue that introduces alternative ideas in thought and practice. Dissent, therefore, has to be directed to a matter of importance. It can be a form of protest, although protest is generally more organized. And therefore, it is perhaps better to say that dissent can change into or become a form of protest. A distinguishing and significant feature, and I strongly underline this, is that dissent is non-violent. Dissent tends to be more vocal in what we call complex societies that bring together a variety of communities following diverse occupations. Social rules are different and belief systems are different. The greater needs of varying cultures can encourage dissent among some and not among others. Dissent is significant, for instance, to the kind of cultures that are brought together in what we call civilizations. The process of formulating the requirements of civilization, for instance, meant selecting ideas and forms of expression and discarding some, but furthering others. This interplay, as it were, of conformity and dissent cannot be ignored. Dissent encourages the questioning of the world in which we live, and in this process, alternatives are formulated. Any advance in knowledge requires questioning existing knowledge. Existing explanations sometimes give way to newer and better ones. Otherwise, there is stagnation. Dissent lies at the root of philosophical discourse, as is stated more than once in Indian philosophical discussion. Let me give you an example. It is said that when making a statement of some consequence, the first step is to state clearly and at length the views of the opponent who is disagreeing with the proposed argument. So you first state the views of the opponent. This is referred to as the Purva Paksha. The second step is the refutation of this argument by the one who is proposing a statement, the Pratipaksha. And finally, there is a debate or a dialogue between the two points of view, and there is a hope of a solution, the Siddhanta. This seemingly dialectical method appears to have been practiced in the debates that are referred to as taking place in royal courts. For instance, there is a debate between the Shaivas and the Buddhists at the court of Harshavardhana of Kanauj in the 7th century AD. What this procedure recognizes is the centrality of dissent and the importance of dialogue in the search for a solution when dissent is registered. My examples of dissent are from the religions of pre-modern India. This is not because I think that religion is the primary area where dissent is registered, but because dissent can be seen with greater clarity in every religion. Secondly, my concern is not with dissent in the theological aspects of religion, but in social theories that religions construct. How do religions construct society? What is the role of dissent in that construction? Especially those that attract a following through explaining human existence. These are religions in which there is much more debate between different points of view. The explanations that they suggest were diverse. And in modern times, however, attempts were made to bring all religious movements in India, other than Islam and Christianity, under a single umbrella. They were seen as multiple manifestations of the same religious doctrine, with few dissenting opinions. This is not very helpful in understanding them, as not all of them conform, and many do disagree. So recognizing the disagreement makes them more visible. That is why it is important to look at dissent in religion. In the study of Indian religion, it is often the diversity of sects in each case that give directions to religions, rather than any monolithic unities which we tend to ascribe to them. Religious institutions reflect social values and activity, and apart from monasteries and nunneries that are distinct from society, there are institutions such as places of worship or schools of learning that contribute substantially to the actions and ethics of a society. The intersection of religious ideas and social activities often did lead to dissenting opinions and the breaking away of a group, giving rise to a sect. An example of this was, for example, in the early stages of Buddhism, when there was a debate in one of the early Buddhist councils, subsequent to the death of the Buddha, on whether the Sangha, the Buddhist organization, should permit monks to accept monetary donations. This was a hotly debated subject. The multiple sects that sprout around every religion can be expressions of deviance or dissent, or modifications of existing forms. A sect finds its place somewhere along the spectrum. This is a different pattern from a single monotheistic, unified creed and catechism, as in the case of Christianity. This pluralism is characteristic of religion in India, excuse me, and may well relate to its social structure. Let me illustrate what I am saying with a couple of examples where dissent has been crucial to the form taken by religions. An early articulation of this was in what began as a parallel movement, but dissented significantly from established religion. Vedic Brahmanism was the dominant religious presence in the earlier part of the first millennium BC. Multiple gods were worshipped, not as icons, but through elaborate sacrificial rituals that consumed much of the wealth that was produced. Its ethics drew on the belief in the reincarnation of the individual's soul, what was to become the theory of karma. This view met with dissent from what have been broadly termed the Shramana religions, Buddhism in the main, but including the Jains and the Ajivikas. Other dissenters, the Charvak or Lokayat, taught a firmly materialist philosophy. They all denied the existence of deities, and consequently, Vedic texts could not be taken as revealed by deity and therefore sacred. Forms and locations of worship differed from the Vedic, as did the definition of reincarnation and possible liberation from it. Causal explanations, connected, linked explanations, were based on reason and logic. This dissent was only broadly uniform among the Shamanas, as they too registered degrees of disagreement amongst themselves. References to the Brahmana-Shramana confrontations are explicit in the edicts of the Mauryan king Ashoka. He pleaded for greater tolerance and harmony among them. And the period from the Mauryas to the Guptas is one in which the competition is apparent. In the post-Gupta period, Brahmanism emerges triumphant. Brahmanical writing refers to these dissenters as Nastika, non-believers, sometimes even viewed as heretics. And the term continued to be used for them in Sanskrit texts as late as the 16th century. The grammarian Patanjali compares the hostility between Brahmins and Shramans to that between the snake and the mongoose. The term Nastika was not confined to the Shamanas. It was extended to include all non-believers. Thus, in a reference from a 16th century text, the Nastikas, non-believers, included the Turushkas, literally Turks as applied to people from Central Asia, but later on to Muslims. This brings to mind the Islamic term kafir. The irony was that the Turushka did believe in a deity, but his deity was Allah and not any of the Brahmanical gods. So he too was regarded as a Nastika, a non-believers. The Shramanas were Nastikas because they originally did not believe in any deity. But Buddhism had its own dissenters. A significant dichotomy separated the Hinayana and the Mahayana sects, interpreting the teachings of the Buddha through multiple differentiated sects. This was also noticeable when Buddhist missionary activity came to the fore in Central Asia and China during the first millennium AD. It met with conditions different from what it had known in the subcontinent. And this led to fresh questions and answers, and sometimes the founding of a new sect. The degree of demarcation from the existing religious order was variable. The success of a religion depends on its relationship with society. We all know that. And particularly with those in society who are in authority and the elite who provide the patronage and the donations for the rituals. A popular following gives it a different kind of support. And the Shramanas had to compete for patronage to establish their social base. But monastic institutions establishing an alternative system were dependent on society. Vedic Brahmanism had a wealthy, prestigious, generally elite patronage. The popular religion that grew out of these beginnings was what is now being called Puranic Hinduism. It did not formally dissent from Vedic Brahmanism, leaving it to its own Brahmanical devices. Puranic Hinduism incorporated Vaishnava, Shaiva, and Shakta worship, and under these labels also included local cults of different kinds. The focus was on deity. One among the many had prominence, and these deities have either been absent or marginal in Vedic worship. So to that extent, they are new. Each of the major deities of Puranic Hinduism were maintained by distinctive sects with distinctive texts, such as the Purans, and variations within the sects had a large range. Origins, myths, and rituals were recorded, irrespective of whether deities were old or very recent. Like most religions, Puranic Hinduism had both a gentle side, with close human manifestations of deities that the worshipper was comfortable with, as also the more wrathful, angry manifestations of deities. In some forms, they became icons of love, devotion, and compassion, the emotions that guided their worship. One might ask whether this emphasis also drew from the Shramana tradition, with its little emphasis on deity, as well as the Bhakti tradition, which endorsed this gentler side. Hindu institutions were parallel to, but different from, those of the Shramanas. Temples replaced the chaityas, sometimes literally, and often became places of pilgrimage, thereby attracting commercial activities as well. Icons of the deities were introduced with elaborate rituals, some invented afresh. The monastery was as yet alien to Brahmanism, although something echoing it, like the mutt, became a focus of propagation. The renouncer, by contrast, was the monk or the nun, but continued to have limited links with society. In this, the renouncer is different from the ascetic, who was ideally self-exiled and living in isolation. Renunciation was central to Shramanism, being the path to nirvana. It involved dissent from Brahmanical teaching, opting out of the social obligations of the Dharmashastras, and adopting an alternative monastic lifestyle focusing on self-liberation, moksha. However, it was not self-isolation, since contact with society was necessary. The monk had to collect his food as alms from people in the vicinity, and his concern about their well-being was required by the teaching. Violence was disallowed. It can be seen as a reciprocal relationship, new and different from what had existed earlier. The ideal, the symbol, the practice of renunciation was implicit in the image of what came to be called the man who heals, the man who performs miracles, meditates, and is helpful in misfortune, the man whom today we tend to call the holy man. He is not the priest. He lives distanced from society, but wanders through villages and towns. And as an icon, his choice of being a holy man could be used effectively, but could also be abused in giving direction to a community, as often happens. People, after all, are gullible. The later incoming religions brought new ideas. These could either create dissent or be amalgamated into new practices and beliefs. The mixing and the merging of new religious ideas takes shape, for instance, with the coming of various forms of Islam. We refer to this event as starting with the Arabs invading Sindh in the 8th century AD. But in fact, their more effective and long-lasting entry was not as invaders, but as traders, all down the west coast of India, from Gujarat to Kerala. The religious mix that emerged was neither Islam nor Puranic Hinduism. It took the form of new socio-religious sects in origin, drawing from both Puranic Hinduism and Islam, but not conforming to either and evolving independently. Sects such as the Bohras, Khojas, Mapilas, Nawayats, and such like. The entry of Turks, Afghans, and Mughals into northwestern India followed from the familiarity that Central Asia had had with northern India. This was through continuing migrations from early times and commercial exchanges, from Kushan times onwards, through the silk trade, the horse trade, and such like. The Central Asian presence was intensified at historical moments through invasions, but it was actually more firmly established with migration and settlement, naturally. Various schools of Sufi sects spread their version of Islam with their diverse ideas and practices, dissenting from or borrowing from existing religions in India. One of the most interesting examples of this were the exchanges between the Nath yogis and the Sufis in the Punjab. Really fascinating in terms of the history of ideas and the history of religious ideas. This is one explanation as to why the proponents of Krishna Bhakti, devotion to the deity Krishna, is the incarnation of Vishnu, were not only devotees such as Vallabhacharya and Surdas, but also came from well-placed Muslim families. Sayyid Ibrahim Khan, or Ras Khan as he is more popularly called, and Abdul Rahim Khane Khanan, or Rahim, are among those who composed dohas, couplets, in Hindi in praise of Krishna and Radha. The verses are still sung as bandishes in Hindustani classical music. Such devotees were treated as dissenters by the proponents of both the established religions, by the Qazis, Mullahs, and Maulvis on the one hand, and by the Pandits and the Brahmins on the other. So they were treated as dissenters by both groups. Bhakti as a form of religion had multiple nuclei all over the subcontinent. Their verses were devotional and by implication were often social comments, as religious verses sometimes tend to be. In our times, these multiple sects have been treated as part of one unified monolithic religious movement. But they were actually very diverse and responded to specific local religions and regional requirements. They were not defining a subcontinental religion, but they were defining very strong, powerful, sensitive, emotional, regional religions. The diversity and the dissent is apparent. Each Bhakti Sant, and I don't like to use the term saint, I prefer the original Sant that was used for them. Each Bhakti Sant worshipped one deity of choice in his or her own way, with or without rituals, and often through songs, hymns, and narratives in the local language. There was, therefore, an obvious diversity geared to the local region, although there were a few broad similarities. Deities differed, or the same one was worshipped, but in another way, and of course in another language. So the nuances were not the same. The question to ask is, why was there a difference? Generally, little or no mention of other bhakts from distant places is made. Neither Kabir nor Meera, for example, mention the Alvars or the Nayanars of the Tamil-speaking region. For some sants, the worship of the deity was paramount. For others, it was the message of social equality implicit in its devotion. Thus, Ravidas describes his utopia not as a distant paradise, but as the imagined city of Behrampura, the city where there is no sorrow, Behram, because the social equality of all prevails. Social equality is also asserted in the ritual of organized pilgrimages among some sects. Those congregating in devotion at a particular place are all treated as of equal status. This breaks two of the fundamental rules of caste. They eat together and there is no prohibition on touching. For the period of pilgrimage, the rules of the Dharma Shastras do not apply to the pilgrims. Even in those religions that preached the equality of all in the eyes of God or deity or the Holy One, social difference was marked and treated as necessary. The separation between acceptable castes and the lower castes and untouchables was in practice virtually universal. Places of worship or areas within the normal places of worship were demarcated and segregated. And we need to inquire into the forms of dissent that the excluded castes, the Avarnas, or what we sometimes call the Dalits these days, the forms of dissent that these groups may have adopted, although perhaps not openly so. Let me repeat that dissent was always present as an undercurrent in the ideas and movements associated with many aspects of life. Barring the orthodox, keeping the orthodox aside, religion at all social levels was malleable and adjusted, and it adjusted either visibly or invisibly to social and political change, as is evident from the histories of most of the sects that go back to earlier times. There is, for instance, much mutation and reformulation of the religions in colonial times. The presence of dissent needs greater recognition, especially at moments of historical change. What have been called socio-religious reform movements in the 19th century, I'm coming now to the modern period, the Brahmo Samaj, the Arya Samaj, the Prarthana Samaj, and such like, were inevitably imprinted with some degree, small or big, of colonial ideas. They questioned Brahman orthodoxy up to a point, but with the intention of suggesting reform rather than any replacement. The Arya Samaj, for instance, reconstructed Vedic society as a utopia and propagated returning to Vedic values and practices. Such calls for returning to tradition often draw on a somewhat virtually invented tradition, in accord with the ideological and social needs of present times. We must remember that tradition is not something that is sealed and packaged and passed on from generation to generation. It is also questioned, adapted, reformulated from generation to generation, and therefore does change. But among the social and ideological needs of the 19th century, for example, was nationalism, speaking for the emergence of a new socio-political structure, a nation state. Some advocated a new utopia, that of a secular democratic state, something that brought us freedom and independence, and which we have been struggling with and are still struggling with in order to establish such a nation state. Others advocated a new kind of utopia. Others reversed this secular democratic utopia by imagining a future state identified with the majority religion as its most significant feature. Democratic nationalism was a protest against colonial rule, articulated in various ways of dissent, converted into a manifestation of social and political protest. The form it took in the early 20th century was seemingly new to the anti-colonial secular national movement for independence. The question that I am asking is, was this form of dissent and protest really all that new? Or can one think of it in terms of something linked to a tradition that goes back to earlier times of dissent? The protest against colonial rule, incorporating degrees of dissent, attracted a large number of people who became supporters of secular nationalism. This nationalism, secular nationalism, was distinct from the nascent but growing religious nationalisms, the Muslim and the Hindu. These latter had a different agenda and a different teleology. Their intention was to establish religious majoritarian states, the Islamic as Pakistan, and the possibly imminent Hindu Rashtra here in India. These two religious nationalisms took their cue from the colonial understanding of Indian history, and consequently could not and did not confront colonial power. Religious nationalism, by its very premise, cannot accommodate democracy, and primacy given to a particular category of citizens, whether based on religion or ethnicity or language or whatever, conflicts with the idea of the equal rights of all citizens that is fundamental to democracy. Religious nationalism and democracy are inevitably in conflict. The secular national movement, envisaging a democratic nation state, took forward some of the ideas of dissent as had been formulated in earlier times. These were more in keeping with the requirements of groups protesting against colonial rule. A few earlier forms of dissent surfaced once again. Among them were two that were adopted by Gandhi as among his forms of protest. What I'm arguing is that Gandhi took two forms, whether consciously or not is a debatable matter, but there are two forms that he propagated which seem to have connections with an earlier tradition. One was the dharna, where a person went on hunger strike in order to demand certain corrections of governance. And the other was what Gandhi called satyagraha. His awareness of deliberately adapting earlier forms of dissent and protest is currently being researched by scholars. What I'm saying is just a hint, a possible glance in that direction. What I'm arguing in this discussion of dissent in early India is that we should look more closely at the links between the past and the present. And one among the many reasons for the success of these forms of protest in the 20th century may have been, and I'm emphasizing may have been, that the Indian people were familiar with these forms of protest as a recognized articulation of dissent from earlier times. They were not entirely unknown forms of dissent. Where Gandhi resorts to fasts to make a political demand, either from the colonial power or from competing nationalisms, he is projected as an independent person with the stature of a Mahatma, literally the great soul, in effect, the holy man. He takes it upon himself to speak for the people of India in supporting their demand for freedom or to live in harmony, else he will lose his life through the fast. As one symbolizes dissent, he needed the stature to take this position. This was recognized both by the Indian people and by the colonial power, either directly or indirectly. Gandhi's major formulation of a method of dissent, which became associated with him, was what he called satyagraha, literally holding the truth. The creation of this form of dissent drew partly and perhaps subconsciously from a tradition of dissent that prevailed in the many cultures of India and which I have referred to earlier. Thus, I would argue that satyagraha was a form of dissent that evoked older practices in a modern situation and without consciously linking it to the actual older forms. It's an evocation. It can be called dissent since it had characteristics familiar to the Indian people, recalled by the continuing presence of the renouncers, the shamanas, the bhakti sants, the yogis, the pirs and the fakirs, and other categories of what are often referred to as holy men. The iconic use of the phrase, I think it was by Churchill, of the half-naked fakir for Gandhi, evoked unintentionally the established tradition of dissenters. All of the latter claimed the right to deny their consent to what existed if they so wished. These characteristics are evident. Dissent is not just disagreement. Its intention has an objective. The objective in South Africa was not identical with the later one in India. Nevertheless, dissent is directed towards political and social change and ensuring the well-being of people. This makes it reminiscent of the aims of the earlier dissenters, the shamanas and the bhakti sants in particular. It does not merely advocate a return to a vague fantasy of a golden age. It defines that age, even if differently. Nonviolence is a marked component, hence its description as passive resistance or civil disobedience. It endorses a dialogue between opposite opinions in order to arrive at a solution, reminiscent of the method that I described earlier, which was suggested for solving opposing arguments. It speaks to and includes all and every citizen of a nation, men and women. There are no priorities of certain people being more entitled to citizenship than others. It is specifically not majoritarianism, and implicit in its thinking is the need for the foundation of the society to be democratic. It is irrespective of religion, of caste, or of status. Women are encouraged to participate. The presence of women is particularly striking, as indeed it was in the earlier movements of dissent. It was, after all, the Shramanas that permitted women to take up renunciation as nuns, admittedly after some debate and persuasion. Women sants such as Andal, Meera, Laldev were accepted as teachers. It is often forgotten that the confined condition of women, as advocated in the Dharmashastra texts, is not what was advocated in all texts and practices in past times. Many were different, whatever the degree of difference. The national movement did not necessarily treat all women as liberated citizens, but it was a realization that if dissent is to be effective as passive resistance, it must be the voice of both men and women. And the Salt Satyagraha, the Dandi March, was one such. It would be worth knowing in greater detail how such events were given form, who participated on a broader level, and why, apart from the call of the Mahatma. It is equally important to ascertain the reaction of the participants to how they understood the essential meaning of such activities. After 1947, passive resistance on any subcontinental scale has not been used when disagreeing with the laws of any of our governments. Nevertheless, sporadic expressions of dissent have been and can be the reason for arrest, as happened earlier under colonial governance and continues to this day. What, however, comes to mind are the two recent events of Shaheen Bagh and the farmers' protest in the vicinity of Delhi. Shaheen Bagh and protests linked to it in other cities had a larger component of women and of young people, students in the main, expressing their opposition to the new law, the Citizen Amendment Act of the government, debarring some categories of people from citizenship. The overwhelming presence of women and Muslim women was deeply significant. It was women opposing patriarchy and gender discrimination and the rules of orthodoxy. In endorsing the Constitution, as they repeatedly did, they were stating their support for secularism. The farmers' protest was against newly formulated laws on agricultural produce. The protesters were non-violent, in both cases, demanding a dialogue on the recently passed laws and their future. This also ties into the bigger question inherent to decisions in a democracy as to how these laws were being received by those most closely affected by them. In a democratic society, their voice has to be heard. Dissenting views today have a new dimension. We are no longer a colony ruled by a colonizer. We have been aspiring to function as a nation state, that is, as a secular democracy, and have been aspiring for many decades. In this context, protests can also be viewed as a comment on the questions being raised in discussions in many places. Do we need to fine-tune the concept of democracy, perhaps, to prevent its being derailed, as is feared that this is happening in some situations? Inevitably, the wider aspects of democracy have to be discussed, such as additional ways of debating disagreement and agreement, and finding solutions to the problems that we're facing today. Does elected representation suffice in conveying what people want? How, for example, can we strengthen the institutions that protect democracy? Can the three constitutional pillars, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, be made more secure and more autonomous, especially as guardians of the rights of citizens? Such questions are pertinent in the context of how democracy should function now and in the future. The failures in democratic functioning in the past century, with authoritarian systems and dictatorships coming to power in parts of Europe and Asia, had disastrous consequences for humanity. The repetition of that pattern is not called for. One may well ask as to what Gandhi would have said to recent forms of passive resistance. A distinction between the colonial situation and that in an independent nation state should be evident when it comes to the role of dissent. The passive resistance of Gandhi asserted dissent and evolved into protest. The legitimacy of such forms in a democratic nation state draw on public opinion. In some polities across the world today, dissent is treated as an anti-national act. Yet, it is well established that the pivot, the focus, the central point of a liberal secular democracy is a wide-ranging debate prior to decisions, which has to come to terms with dissenting views. Let me repeat what our philosophers from the past maintained. There can be no Siddhanta solution if the views of the Purva Paksha, the opponent, are silenced by the Pratipaksha, the proponent. The articulation of the dialogue and debate between the two is absolutely essential. Let me conclude by saying that it is imperative that we understand the historical centrality of dissent. It was and is essential to the formulating of cultures and to establishing democratic norms. We have to recognize the inevitability of dissent in the events that shape our history and that are now shaping the present. Thank you.
ਜੀ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਮੈਮ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਬੜੇ ਪ੍ਰਾਚੀਨ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ 'ਤੇ ਕੰਟੈਂਪਰੇਰੀ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਸਾਰੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਹੈ ਡਿਸੈਂਟ ਦੀ ਉਹ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ। ਅਸੀਂ ਕਾਫੀ ਕੁਛ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਇਸ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਮੈਂ ਪੜ੍ਹ ਚੁੱਕਿਆ ਕਿਤਾਬ, ਅਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਵੀ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਸੁਣੀ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਆਸ ਕਰਦਾ ਕਿ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਰੋਤਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਾਫੀ ਕੁਛ ਗ੍ਰਹਿਣ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੋਊਗਾ ਕਿ ਡਿਸੈਂਟ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਹਰ ਸਮੇਂ ਮੌਜੂਦ ਰਹਿੰਦੀ ਆ। ਸਾਡੀ ਪ੍ਰਾਚੀਨ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਕੰਟੈਂਪਰੇਰੀ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਤੱਕ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਡਿਸੈਂਟ ਹੈ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਡੈਮੋਕ੍ਰੇਸੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਮਾਡਲ ਅਸੀਂ ਅੱਜ ਸਾਡੇ ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਚੱਲ ਰਿਹਾ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਡਿਸੈਂਟ ਹੋਣੀ, ਅਸਹਿਮਤੀ ਹੋਣੀ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਆ, ਤਾਂ ਹੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਡੈਮੋਕ੍ਰੇਸੀ ਦੇ ਅਗਲੇ ਪੜਾਅ ਉਹਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਵਿਭਿੰਨ ਪੱਖ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਕਰ ਸਕਾਂਗੇ। ਸੋ ਮੈਮ, ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਕੋਈ ਸਵਾਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਰਿਹਾ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਦੇ ਦੌਰਾਨ, ਆਪਣੇ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਦੇ ਦੌਰਾਨ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਾਣਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਉਹ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸਾਡੀ ਮੈਨੇਜਮੈਂਟ ਤਰਫੋਂ, ਸਾਡੇ ਪ੍ਰਿੰਸੀਪਲ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਗੁਰਜਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਬਰਾੜ ਜੀ ਵੱਲੋਂ, ਮੇਰੇ ਵੱਲੋਂ, ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਤੇ ਸਟਾਫ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਮੰਚ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਆਏ, ਤੇ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਨਾਲ ਪਿਛੋਕੜ ਹੈ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅੱਜ ਆਪਣਾ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਸਾਂਝਾ ਕੀਤਾ, ਤੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਣੇ ਵਿਊ ਰੱਖੇ ਨੇ, ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਸ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਜੇ ਕਦੇ ਸਬੱਬ ਬਣਿਆ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਫਲਾਈਨ ਵੀ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਸਾਂਝਾ ਕਰਨਾ ਆਓਗੇ, ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਮੰਨ ਕੇ ਚੱਲਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਇਨ ਫਿਊਚਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਭਵਿੱਖ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਯੋਜਿਤ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਜੀ ਮੈਡਮ, ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਜੀ। ਮੈਮ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੁਝ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਚਾਹੋਗੇ? ਅਸੀਂ ਚਾਹਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰੋ ਜਿੰਨੀ ਕੁ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀ ਹੈ।
पंजाबी से गलबात ही हो सकती है, इलेक्शन नहीं ना हो सकता।
जी,
ये मेरी मुश्किल है।
जी जी, हाँ जी मैम, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੁਝ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਚਾਹੋਗੇ ਅਖੀਰ ਤੇ ਜੀ?
मैं काफी कह लिया उन्हें, घंटे ਲਈ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਗਈ ਹਾਂ।
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਜੀ ਮੈਮ, ਜੀ ਮੈਮ, ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ, ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਮੰਚ ਤੇ ਆਏ, ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਇਸ ਮੰਚ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੀ ਨਵੀਂ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ, ਤੇ ਸਰੋਤਿਓ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਤੋਂ ਕਾਫੀ ਕੁਝ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੜਾ ਪ੍ਰਸੰਗਿਕ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਆ। ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਡਿਸੈਂਟ ਦੀ, ਅਸਹਿਮਤੀ ਦੀ ਬੜੀ ਲੋੜ ਆ। ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਹਾਲਾਤ ਬਣੇ ਹੋਏ ਨੇ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਨਵੇਂ ਪਾਸੇ ਸੋਚਣ ਲਾਏਗੀ। ਪ੍ਰਾਚੀਨ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਸਮਕਾਲ ਤੱਕ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਡਿਸੈਂਟ ਚੱਲਦੀ ਆਈ ਆ, ਉਹ ਤੋਂ ਸਿੱਖ ਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ, ਉਹ ਤੋਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਮੈਡਮ ਨੇ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਹਿਸਟੋਰੀਕਲ ਹਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ, ਉਹਦੇ ਪੜ੍ਹ ਕੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਡਿਸੈਂਟ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਅਸਹਿਮਤੀ ਆ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਪ੍ਰਵਾਨ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਦੋ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਹੋਣਗੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਡਿਸੈਂਟ ਵੀ ਹੋਏਗੀ, ਤੇ ਡਿਸੈਂਟ ਤੇ ਅਸਹਿਮਤੀ ਵੀ ਹੋਏਗੀ। ਉਸ ਅਸਹਿਮਤੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਹੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਜਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਸੋ ਮੈਡਮ ਨੇ ਪ੍ਰਾਚੀਨ ਹਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਂਝੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ, ਪੂਰੀ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਸਾਂਝੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ, ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਹਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਕਾਫੀ ਕੁਝ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਸਿੱਖਿਆ ਹੋਏਗਾ, ਤੇ ਇਹਨੂੰ, ਇਸ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੇਖਣ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਕਰੋਗੇ। ਜੀ ਮੈਮ।
ਹਾਂ, ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਠੀਕ ਹੈ
ਜੀ ਜੀ। ਸੋ ਸਾਰੇ ਸਰੋਤਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਵੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਜੁੜੇ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਤੇ ਮੈਡਮ ਜੀ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ, ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਸ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਮੁਲਾਕਾਤ ਵੀ ਹੋਏਗੀ, ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਵਰਚੁਅਲੀ ਨਾ ਸੁਣ ਕੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਆਫਲਾਈਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੁਣਾਂਗੇ। ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਮੈਮ।
ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਵੀ ਹੋਏ, ਮੈਨੂੰ ਬੁਲਾਇਆ ਤੁਸੀਂ, ਬਹੁਤ ਕੁਝ ਕੀਤਾ।
ਨਹੀਂ ਵੈਲਕਮ ਮੈਮ, ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਹਮੇਸ਼ਾ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਹੈ ਜੀ। ਅਸੀਂ ਆਸ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਖਿੱਤੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਆ ਉਹ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਰਹੇ। ਜੀ, ਸੋ ਸਾਰੇ ਸਰੋਤਿਓ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ। ਅਗਲੇ ਐਤਵਾਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਟੌਪਿਕ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ, ਕਿਸੇ ਵਿਸ਼ੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਫਿਰ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਸਨਮੁਖ ਹੋਵਾਂਗੇ। ਤਦ ਤੱਕ ਲਈ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ, ਨਮਸਤੇ।
ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ।